It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Just me, my boyfriend Eric, and our dog Sadie. We'd heard about this abandoned town in the middle of nowhere, Black Hollow, and decided to stop by. People on forums said it was one of the creepiest ghost towns in America, and we thought it'd make for a fun little detour. We weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers. It was just supposed to be a quick stop for a few pictures, then back on the road. When we got there, the town looked frozen in time. Rusting cars, shattered windows, and faded signs swinging lazily in the wind. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like the atmosphere was pressing down on my chest, but I figured it was just my nerves. Eric joked that maybe we'd find a long-lost treasure, while Sadie tugged at her leash, sniffing the cracked asphalt. The first thing that caught our attention was the church. It stood at the edge of the town, its white paint peeling like dead skin. The doors hung open, creaking softly. Eric, being his usual curious self, wanted to go inside. I hesitated. Something about it felt off, but he laughed and said we couldn't come all this way and not explore. Against my better judgment, I followed. The inside was worse. Pews were overturned, hymnals scattered across the floor, and the air smelled like mildew and rot. But the weirdest thing was the altar. Candles, still half burned, stood in a perfect circle, as if someone had used them recently. Eric shrugged it off, saying it was probably just kids messing around. But I swear I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the far wall. "Let's check out the houses," Eric said, grinning. He was so excited I didn't want to be the killjoy, so I followed him outside. The houses were worse than the church. They felt lived in. Plates still sat on dining tables, as if the families had gotten up mid-meal and never came back. Old toys littered the floors and photographs hung crooked on the walls. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt stolen. Sadie started growling in one of the houses. She was staring at the staircase, her hackles raised. Eric said she probably smelled a raccoon, but I wasn't so sure. There was this feeling, this oppressive, choking silence, that made me want to leave immediately. I pulled on Eric's arm and told him we should go. He sighed, but agreed. As we headed back to the car, I noticed something strange. The sun, which had been high in the sky when we arrived, was already setting. But it wasn't just the time that seemed wrong, it was the light itself. The colors of the sunset looked off, darker, almost sickly, like blood smeared across the horizon. When we reached the car, Sadie started barking furiously. At first, I thought she was just spooked by the town, but then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible in the fading light. They were too far away to make out any details, but something about the way they stood, so still and rigid, sent chills crawling up my spine. "Hey!" Eric called out, waving. "You need help or something?" The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. Eric nodded and unlocked the car. As soon as we got inside, Sadie jumped into the back seat, still growling. Eric started the engine and we pulled onto the road. But the road wasn't the same. The twists and turns were sharper, more disorienting. Eric muttered that it felt longer than when we came in, but we both chalked it up to nerves. Then we passed the church again. "Wait," I said. "How are we back here?" Eric frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. "I don't know. I didn't turn around." He kept driving, faster this time. But no matter which way he turned, we kept ending up back at the same church. The same peeling paint, the same creaking doors. "Stop," I said, panic rising in my throat. "We need to stop." Eric slammed on the brakes and we sat there, breathing heavily. Sadie whimpered in the back seat, her tail tucked between her legs. I glanced out the window and saw them again. The figure. Closer this time. Standing at the edge of the churchyard. "Drive!" I screamed. Eric floored it, tires screeching against the pavement. The figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the road stretched endlessly ahead of us. It didn't make sense. We should have been out of the town by now, but the landscape looped over and over, like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. And then the car died. Eric cursed, slamming his fist against the wheel. He tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't start. We were stranded in the middle of that godforsaken town, surrounded by silence. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded angry. Sadie started barking again, louder this time, her eyes fixed on something in the dark. The whispers grew louder, closer. I turned to Eric, tears streaming down my face. "What do we do?" "We run," he said, grabbing Sadie's leash. "We run until we're out of here." We took off, sprinting down the road with Sadie leading the way. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them. Footsteps, dozens of them chasing us. And the whispers, they turned into screams, blood-curdling, inhuman screams that echoed in my head. The houses blurred as we ran past, their windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. Shadows moved inside, figures watching us, reaching for us. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they would collapse, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch us. Finally, we saw it, the edge of the town. The welcome sign, rusted and overgrown, loomed ahead. We pushed ourselves harder, and the screams began to fade. As soon as we crossed the boundary, the air changed. The weight lifted, and the world snapped back into focus. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. It was sitting on the side of the highway, engine running like nothing had happened. Eric didn't question it. We jumped in, and he floored it, not slowing down until we were miles away. That was 2 years ago. We never talked about it, not really. Every time I try to bring it up, Eric shuts down. Sadie, she's never been the same. She flinches at shadows and refuses to go on walks at night. And me? I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, the shadows, the endless road. Last week, I found a postcard on my doorstep. It was old and faded with a picture of Black Hollow on the front. On the back, written in smeared black ink, were 4 words, "You can't escape forever."
Story number 2.
The last time I saw my brother, we were standing in the middle of a dead town, arguing about a locked door. We'd heard about the place from some locals. Dry Creek. Just another ghost town in the middle of nowhere, they said. Abandoned after a mining collapse with rumors of strange disappearances. Some said the place was cursed. My brother Will loved that kind of stuff. Me? Not so much. But he convinced me to come along, promising it'd just be a fun little adventure. The first thing we noticed when we arrived was the silence. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the wind scraping through the empty streets. The town looked like it had been frozen in time. Dust-covered wagons sat in the street, a general store with its sign barely hanging on, and a saloon with shattered windows and a broken piano inside. But what caught Will's attention was the building at the end of the street. A brick structure with no sign or markings, just a heavy iron door. It didn't fit with the rest of the town. It looked wrong, like it shouldn't be there. "Let's check it out," Will said, already walking toward it. I hesitated. The door gave off a strange vibe, like it was watching us. "Maybe we should leave it alone," I said. "Come on, it's just a door," he replied, rolling his eyes. The door was locked, of course. Will pulled out his pocket knife, jamming it into the keyhole. I told him to stop, but he just laughed and said, "What's the worst that could happen?" The lock clicked, and the door swung open. A rush of cold air hit us, and the faint smell of rot wafted out. I wanted to turn around right then, but Will was already stepping inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I followed, my stomach in knots. The inside was worse than I expected. The air was damp, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, like something had been clawing at them for years. The floor was littered with broken furniture and what looked like old bones. Will shone his flashlight on one of the walls, and we both froze. There were words scratched into the plaster, over and over, in jagged, frantic letters. "Do not open the door." "What the hell?" I whispered. Will grinned, trying to act brave. Probably just some crazy miners. But his voice wavered. We kept walking, deeper into the building. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every door we passed was locked, the handles rusted and useless. The air grew colder with each step, and the scratching on the walls became more erratic. Then we heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. "What was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Will shrugged, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Probably just an animal." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound grew louder, coming from somewhere ahead of us. We turned a corner and found ourselves in front of another door. This one wasn't like the others. It was massive, made of steel, with heavy chains crisscrossing over it. Strange symbols were etched into the metal, and the air around it felt alive, like it was vibrating. "That's creepy," Will said, stepping closer. "Don't," I warned. Every instinct in my body was screaming to leave. "We need to get out of here." But Will didn't listen. He reached out, brushing his fingers against the cold steel. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then the chains began to rattle. Slowly at first, then violently, as if something on the other side was trying to break free. The symbols on the door glowed faintly, a sickly red light that made my skin crawl. "Let's go," I begged, grabbing Will's arm. But he was transfixed, staring at the door like he was in a trance. The rattling grew louder, and the door started to bulge outward, the metal groaning under the strain. "Will, we have to go!" I shouted. Finally, he snapped out of it, and we turned to run. But the hallway wasn't the same. The walls had shifted, the scratches now forming strange, jagged patterns. The air felt heavier, and the faint sound of whispers filled the space around us. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded wrong, like they weren't meant for human ears. We ran, turning corner after corner, but the exit was nowhere in sight. The building seemed alive, twisting and changing, trapping us inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. Then Will screamed. I turned and saw him on the floor, clawing at his face. His flashlight had rolled away, its beam casting long, flickering shadows. "It's in my head!" he cried. "Get it out!" I grabbed him, trying to pull him to his feet, but he wouldn't move. His eyes were wild, darting around like he was seeing something I couldn't. Then he stopped. He went completely still, his eyes locking onto something behind me. I turned slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. There was something in the darkness. A figure, tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and joints that bent the wrong way. Its face was a void, just blackness, where features should have been. It moved toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with its strings tangled. "Run," Will whispered. Before I could respond, he pushed me hard, sending me stumbling down the hallway. "Go!" he shouted. I didn't want to leave him, but the thing was closing in, its footsteps echoing unnaturally in the narrow space. Will grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and swung it at the creature, buying me a few seconds to run. I sprinted blindly, the whispers now replaced by an ear-splitting screech that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The hallway stretched endlessly, but then, miraculously, I saw it, the exit. The iron door was still open, the dim light of the town spilling in. I didn't look back. I ran through the door and slammed it shut behind me, collapsing on the ground outside. My chest heaved and my vision blurred with tears. But Will didn't make it. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, hoping he would burst through it. But he never did. The town was silent again, the wind brushing against the empty streets like nothing had happened. Eventually, I made my way back to the car and drove, leaving Dry Creek in the rearview mirror. But I've never truly left it behind. The whispers still haunt me in the dead of night when everything is quiet. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see Will's face, twisted in terror, staring at something I can't see. A week after I got home, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single, rusted chain and a note that read, "It's not locked anymore."
Story number 3.
They say some places are cursed, not because of what happened there, but because of what lives there still. I didn't believe it, not until I saw it for myself. I wish I hadn't. It started with a dare. My best friend Nate, our classmate Jen, and I were bored out of our minds that summer. We'd heard whispers about Stony Ridge, an abandoned mining town deep in the woods. According to local legend, the miners had all vanished overnight in the late 1800s, leaving their tools, meals, and even their families behind. Search parties went looking, but they found nothing, except for strange symbols carved into the trees. People said the town was cursed, haunted by something ancient and hungry. Nate thought it was hilarious. "Come on, it's just a ghost story. We'll take some pictures, maybe freak each other out, and call it a night." Jen wasn't so sure. She'd grown up hearing the stories, and her grandmother had always warned her to stay away from Stony Ridge. But Nate was persistent, and eventually, we all piled into his car with flashlights, snacks, and a map he printed from the internet. The road to Stony Ridge was narrow and overgrown, barely visible in the moonlight. By the time we reached the outskirts of the town, it was past midnight. The first thing we noticed was the cold. It wasn't a typical summer night chill. It was bone deep, like the air itself was angry we were there. The town was exactly as people described, eerily intact. Wooden buildings leaned at odd angles, their windows like hollow eyes staring into the dark. A rusted cart sat in the middle of the dirt road, its wheels frozen in place. The silence was suffocating, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. "Creepy, but cool," Nate said, snapping pictures with his phone. Jen didn't say anything. She just hugged her jacket tighter and stuck close to me. We wandered through the town, peeking into buildings. Most of them were empty, filled only with broken furniture and decades of dust. But then we found the church. It stood at the edge of the town, its spire reaching toward the starless sky. Unlike the other buildings, it was in perfect condition, No rot, no broken windows, just a heavy wooden door carved with strange symbols. They looked like runes, jagged and sharp, and they sent a shiver down my spine. "We have to go inside," Nate said, already reaching for the door. Jen grabbed his arm. "No, this place isn't right. We need to leave." Nate laughed. "Don't tell me you believe the stories." "I don't care if they're true," she shot back. "This place feels wrong." But Nate wasn't listening. He pushed open the door, and a rush of cold air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of decay. Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. Jen hesitated, muttering a prayer under her breath before stepping in behind us. The inside of the church was worse than I could have imagined. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols like the ones on the door, but more intricate, more violent. The pews were overturned, and the altar was blackened, as if it had been scorched by fire. Candles lined the walls, their wax dripping onto the floor in patterns that looked deliberate. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, its edges worn smooth from years of use. "Let's check it out," Nate said, already moving toward it. Jen grabbed his arm again. "No. I'm serious, Nate. We shouldn't be here." But he brushed her off, pulling the trapdoor open. A set of stairs led down into darkness, the air below even colder than before. Nate aimed his flashlight into the void, grinning like he'd found buried treasure. "Come on," he said. "You don't want to go home without a good story, do you?" Jen refused to go any farther, so she stayed by the door while Nate and I descended. The steps creaked under our weight, and the darkness seemed to press in on us. The walls were damp, and the air smelled metallic, like rust or blood. At the bottom of the stairs was a long tunnel, the ceiling so low we had to duck. Nate led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The walls were covered in more symbols, their lines jagged and uneven, as though they'd been carved in a frenzy. "Do you hear that?" Nate asked, stopping suddenly. I strained my ears. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, faintly, I caught it. A low, rhythmic chanting, coming from deeper within the tunnel. "We should go back," I whispered. But Nate ignored me, pushing forward. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out the words. Not in English, but in some guttural ancient language that made my skin crawl. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls lined with more candles. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and on it lay something covered in a dark, tattered cloth. The chanting was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls like a living thing. Nate stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I wanted to pull him back, to leave before whatever was happening here noticed us. But then he reached out and pulled the cloth away. I wish I hadn't seen what was underneath. It was a figure, humanoid but wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits, staring straight at us. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the flickering candlelight. As soon as the cloth was removed, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, the figure's head turned toward us. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Nate's arm. But he didn't move. He was frozen, staring into those black pits. The thing on the altar began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. I screamed and yanked Nate toward the tunnel, and finally he snapped out of it. We ran, the sound of something following us echoing through the darkness. Its footsteps didn't match ours. They were faster, heavier, closing the distance between us with every second. When we reached the stairs, Jen was waiting, her face pale. "What's happening?" she cried. "No time," I shouted, pushing her out the door. The three of us sprinted through the town, the thing's footsteps never far behind. The air felt heavier, like it was trying to hold us in place. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and the symbols on the buildings seemed to glow faintly, as though they were alive. When we finally reached the car, Nate fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The footsteps stopped just as we slammed the doors shut, and for a moment, the world was silent again. But then, as Nate started the engine, I saw it. Standing in the doorway of the church, silhouetted against the flickering candlelight, was the figure from the altar. It watched us as we sped away, its black eyes burning into my memory. We didn't stop driving until we reached Jen's house. None of us said a word. We were too afraid to even look at each other. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face. And then, around 3 a.m., I got a text from Nate. All it said was, "It's here." I called him immediately, but he didn't answer. The next morning, I drove to his house, but he was gone. His car was in the driveway, the door to his room locked. The only thing I found was his phone, lying on his bed with one last text message open: "Do not open the door."
Story number 4.
I grew up in a small Midwest town that most people wouldn't even notice on a map. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing exciting ever happened. But there was one place everyone avoided: a stretch of woods at the edge of town called Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek had a reputation. People said it was haunted, cursed, whatever you want to call it. The stories always involved people disappearing or hearing strange voices in the trees. I never believed in any of it. To me, it was just a creepy old forest, the kind of place kids dared each other to visit. That's exactly how it started the night we went in. It was me, my cousin Eric, and our friend Sarah. We were all bored out of our minds, and Eric had just gotten his hands on his dad's old camcorder. "Let's make a movie," he said. "We'll film a ghost hunt in Hollow Creek." Sarah shook her head. "That place is bad news. My uncle swears he saw something in there when he was a kid." Eric rolled his eyes. "Come on, Sarah. It's just trees and shadows. Nothing's going to happen." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I went along with it. By 10 p.m., we were standing at the edge of the woods, the camcorder's red light blinking in the darkness. The air was cool, and the trees loomed over us like silent sentinels. Eric was the first to step inside, grinning like it was no big deal. "See? Just a forest." Sarah and I exchanged a look, but followed him. The first few minutes were uneventful. The woods were eerily quiet, though, with no signs of animals or even the rustling of leaves. It felt like we were being watched. Sarah stayed close to me, her flashlight bouncing off the trees. "Let's go deeper," Eric said, his voice louder than it needed to be. I think he was trying to scare us, or himself. As we walked, the trees grew denser, their twisted branches blotting out the moonlight. The air grew colder, and I started to notice something strange. The path we'd been following wasn't there anymore. It was like the forest had shifted, trapping us in its depths. "Didn't we pass that tree already?" Sarah whispered, pointing to a gnarled trunk with a scar-like mark. Eric shrugged. "Maybe it just looks similar. Relax." But then we heard it, a low, distant sound like a woman crying. We all froze. The sound echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Eric nodded, his bravado slipping. "It's probably just an animal." "Does that sound like an animal to you?" I shot back. The crying grew louder, closer, and I swear it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us. My pulse was racing, and I could feel Sarah trembling beside me. Eric raised the camcorder, pointing it toward the trees. "If there's someone out there, we're just filming. We're not here to hurt you." His voice cracked on the last word. The crying stopped. For a moment, the silence was even worse. Then came the laughter. It started soft, like a child giggling, but it quickly grew louder and more manic, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound right. It wasn't human. It was like someone trying to mimic laughter and failing horribly. "Let's go back," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, let's just go back." Eric didn't argue this time. We turned around, or at least we tried to. The path we'd come down was gone, replaced by more trees and underbrush. It didn't make sense. "This way," Eric said, picking a direction at random. We followed him, moving as quickly as we could without tripping over roots. The laughter followed us, growing fainter and then louder, as if it were toying with us. Then we saw the cabin. It came out of nowhere, a crumbling structure half hidden by the trees. The windows were broken, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Eric hesitated, pointing the camcorder at it. "Should we check it out?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "We should keep moving." But I was curious, and against my better judgment, I said, "What if there's someone inside? What if they're hurt?" Reluctantly, we approached the cabin. The air grew colder as we got closer, and that feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. Eric pushed the door open, and the smell hit us immediately. Rotting wood and something metallic, like old blood. Inside, the walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They looked ancient, wrong, like something you weren't supposed to see. In the corner of the room was a pile of bones, too big to be animals and too broken to be whole. Sarah gagged, backing out of the cabin. "This is a mistake. We need to leave." Eric nodded, lowering the camcorder. For once, he looked just as scared as we felt. But as we turned to go, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. "Who's there?" Eric called, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Then, a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, answered from just beyond the door. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah screamed, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. Eric dropped the camcorder, and it hit the floor with a loud clatter. We bolted, running blindly into the trees. The laughter was back, louder and more frenzied, and I swear I could hear something chasing us. Its footsteps didn't match ours. They were heavier, faster, and they sounded like they were right behind us. "Keep going," Eric shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening screech that seemed to come from everywhere. I don't know how long we ran. Time didn't feel real anymore, and the forest seemed endless. Finally, we burst out of the trees and onto the road where we'd parked, but something was wrong. The car was there, but it was rusted, its windows shattered. The road itself was cracked and overgrown with weeds. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. "What the hell?" Eric whispered, staring at the car. That's when I noticed the forest behind us. The trees had shifted again, their branches twisted into claw-like shapes. And standing just beyond the tree line were figures. Dozens of them, pale and skeletal, their empty eyes watching us. One of them stepped forward. It was a woman, her face impossibly gaunt, her smile stretching too wide. She raised a hand and pointed at us. "You'll never leave," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. We didn't wait to find out what she meant. We ran down the road, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. When we looked back, the road and the forest were gone, just an empty field stretching into the night. We never spoke about that night again. Eric sold the camcorder without watching the footage. Sarah moved away the next summer, and I don't blame her. As for me, I still hear the laughter sometimes, faint and distant, in the dead of night. And every now and then, when I pass that empty field, I see the trees.
Story number 5.
I never should have taken the job. I knew that the moment I stepped into Ashwood Manor, but desperation has a way of dulling instincts. Bills were piling up, and this night shift security job seemed like an easy paycheck. Watching over an abandoned mansion? How hard could it be? The estate sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by miles of dense forest. The locals whispered about it, claiming it was cursed. Ashwood Manor had been built in the 1800s by the wealthy Ashwood family, who mysteriously vanished one night without a trace. Servants, family members, everyone gone. Some said they'd been murdered, others claimed they'd left willingly, drawn to something in the forest. Whatever the truth, the place had been abandoned ever since. I arrived just before sunset, my car kicking up dust as I pulled into the driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, its once grand facade weathered and crumbling. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. The man who hired me, Mr. Caldwell, met me at the front door. He was a stern, no-nonsense type with a face carved by years of stress. He handed me a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and a key ring. "Your job's simple," he said, his voice gravely. "Patrol the house, make sure no one's trespassing, and whatever you do, don't go into the basement." I frowned. "Why not?" He glared at me. "Just don't. Lock the door if you have to. If you hear anything, call me. I'll come running." Before I could ask more, he was gone, his car disappearing down the long road. I stood there, clutching the flashlight, staring up at the house. Something about it felt wrong. The windows seemed to watch me, their black emptiness almost alive. I shook off the feeling and stepped inside. The interior was a relic of another era. Just saw dusty chandeliers hung from cracked ceilings and faded wallpaper peeled away in long, curling strips. The floors creaked under my boots as I made my way through the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows. By the time night fell, I'd settled into a routine. Walk the halls, check the locks, shine the flashlight into the corners, rinse, repeat. It was uneventful, almost boring, until I heard the first sound. It was faint, like a child's laughter coming from upstairs. My skin prickled. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old places like this always made weird noises, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I climbed the grand staircase, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. The laughter had stopped, replaced by silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors that seemed to stretch higher than they should. I checked each room, finding nothing but furniture shrouded in white sheets and the smell of mildew. But when I reached the last door, I hesitated. It was slightly ajar, and faintly, I could hear something, a low whisper, like someone talking to themselves. I pushed the door open, flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was empty, just a dusty old bedroom with a canopy bed and an antique mirror. But as I turned to leave, the whispering grew louder. It was coming from the mirror. I froze, staring at my reflection. The glass was old and warped, distorting my face just enough to make it unsettling. But then the reflection moved, just slightly, just enough to make my stomach drop. It wasn't me. The reflection smiled, a slow, sinister grin that didn't belong on my face. Then it raised a hand and pointed to the door. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I bolted out of the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I raced downstairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to call Mr. Caldwell on the walkie-talkie, but all I got was static. Then I heard it again. Laughter. But this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the basement. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Caldwell's warning echoed in my mind. Don't go into the basement. I should have left. I should have grabbed my keys and driven away. But instead, I found myself walking toward the basement door, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The door was slightly open, the darkness beyond it thicker than it should have been. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a faint humming, like an old lullaby. I gripped the flashlight tighter and stepped inside. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with every step. The flashlight barely pierced the darkness, its beam flickering like a dying candle. At the bottom of the stairs, the humming stopped. The basement was enormous, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with jars of unrecognizable things. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a path of footprints leading to the center of the room. And there, in the middle of the basement, was a circle of candles, their flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the center of the circle was a doll, old and cracked, its painted face smiling up at me. I felt a wave of nausea as I approached. The air was heavy, oppressive, like it was pushing down on me. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me, its grin growing wider the closer I got. Then, without warning, the candles went out. I was plunged into darkness, the silence deafening. My flashlight sputtered and died, leaving me alone in the pitch black. My pulse pounded in my ears as I fumbled for the walkie-talkie, my fingers trembling. Before I could call for help, I heard it. A voice, soft and cold, whispering in my ear. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, my hands shaking, but I couldn't see anything. The voice came again, this time from the other side. "You shouldn't have come." Something brushed against my arm, cold, like a hand made of ice. I screamed, stumbling backward, and tripped over something solid. My flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the room for just a second. And in that second, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows. Their faces were pale and featureless, their bodies twisted and wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. They stared at me with hollow eyes, their heads tilting in unison. Then they moved. I don't remember how I made it out. I must have run, but it felt like the house itself was fighting me. The walls stretching, the halls twisting. By the time I burst through the front door tonight, I was gasping for air, my legs barely holding me up. Caldwell's car was parked in the driveway. He was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette, as if nothing had happened. "You went into the basement, didn't you?" he said, not even looking at me. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, tears streaming down my face. He sighed, shaking his head. "They're awake now. You'd better leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I got in my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to Ashwood Manor, and I never heard from Caldwell again. But sometimes late at night I hear the laughter. It's faint, distant, but it's there. And I know they're still watching.
Story number 6.
I never believed in ghosts. That is, until last summer when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping near Old Deer Hollow. The area was infamous for a series of grisly murders back in the 1950s. Some said the spirits of the victims still wandered the forest. Others claimed it was something much darker, something that fed on fear. It was supposed to be a fun trip, a way to unplug and get away from the chaos of city life. There were 4 of us, me, my boyfriend Nick, and our friends Kara and James. We packed up our gear, drove out to the edge of the woods, and hiked several miles to a clearing deep within Old Deer Hollow. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Towering pines surrounded us, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. We set up camp just before sunset. As the sky turned a deep orange, we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed about the spooky stories people told about the forest. "You know," Kara said, her face lit by the flickering flames, "they say if you wander too far, you'll hear the voices. They call your name, try to lure you deeper into the woods." Nick scoffed, tossing a stick into the fire. "That's just some urban legend to scare tourists. This place is just trees and dirt." James grinned. "Sure, but it's always the skeptics who get taken first." We all laughed. but there was an unease in the air that none of us wanted to acknowledge. As the night grew darker, the forest seemed to press in around us. The sounds of wildlife, chirping crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, began to fade. By midnight, it was unnervingly quiet. That's when we heard the first sound. It was faint, like someone walking through the underbrush. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. We all froze, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Probably just a deer, Nick said, but his voice was strained. We tried to brush it off, but the sounds continued. Footsteps, getting closer, then stopping. Then a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "Maybe we should go back," Kara whispered, clutching James's arm. "No," Nick said, his voice firmer now. "We're not letting some animal ruin the trip. Just stay by the fire. It'll keep them away." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. The growl had sounded almost human. We sat in tense silence for a while, the fire crackling loudly in the stillness. That's when we saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the dim light. Tall, gaunt, with long, spindly limbs, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its eyes boring into me. "Do you see that?" Kara whispered, her voice trembling. Nick grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but the beam flickered and went out. When he turned it back on, the figure was gone. "That's it," James said, standing up. "We're leaving. Now." We quickly began packing up, shoving things into our backpacks as fast as we could. But as we prepared to leave, the footsteps started again, closer this time. And then we heard it. My name. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A soft, raspy voice calling, "Anna!" I froze, my blood turning to ice. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Nick nodded, his face pale. "It's just the wind," he said, but we both knew he didn't believe that. The voice came again, louder this time, closer. "Anna, come here!" I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Kara grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the trail. "We need to go, now." We started down the path, the beam of Nick's flashlight cutting through the darkness. But the further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The air grew colder, and the sound of footsteps followed us, echoing in the silence. Then the voices began. Not just mine, but all our names, whispered from every direction. Nick, Kara, James, Anna. Kara started to cry, clutching James's arm as we stumbled through the darkness. "It's not real," Nick muttered, as if saying it would make it true. "It's not real." But then we saw the cabin. It shouldn't have been there. We'd walked this trail earlier that day, and there had been nothing but trees. Now there was a small wooden cabin, its windows glowing with a faint orange light. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the door was slightly ajar. "We should keep moving," James said, his voice shaking. But Nick, ever the skeptic, stepped toward it. "Maybe someone's inside. Maybe they can help." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We're not going in there." Before I could stop him, Nick pushed the door open. The smell hit us immediately, rotting meat and something metallic, like blood. The inside of the cabin was dark, lit only by a single lantern on the floor. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, and in the center of the room was a table. On it lay a deer carcass, its eyes wide and lifeless, its body twisted in ways that didn't seem possible. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. "Nick, let's go!" I shouted, but he was frozen, staring at the carcass. The growl grew louder, and something moved in the darkness. It stepped into the light, a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It let out a bone-chilling scream, and we bolted. We ran blindly into the woods, the voices and footsteps chasing us. The trees seemed to shift, blocking our path, forcing us to turn in circles. No matter which way we went, we couldn't find the trail. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. Then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight skittering out of my hand. When I looked up, I saw it, the figure looming over me, its hollow eyes staring into mine. It reached out a skeletal hand, and I screamed, scrambling backward. Nick grabbed me, pulling me to my feet, and we ran. I don't know how, but eventually we found the road. We stumbled onto the asphalt, gasping for air, and collapsed in exhaustion. When we looked back, the forest was still, silent. The cabin was gone. We didn't speak on the drive back. Kara cried softly in the back seat, and James stared out the window, his face pale. When we got home, we swore we'd never talk about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear my name, soft, faint, carried on the wind. and I know it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 7.
It was a small, forgotten town deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. Elmsworth was its name, though few maps marked it anymore. My brother Sam and I weren't looking for it, but when our car broke down on that lonely stretch of highway, it was the closest place for miles. We arrived on foot as the sun dipped below the mountains, the fading light casting long shadows over the dilapidated buildings. The streets were eerily empty, and the air felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. There were no streetlights, no sound of distant traffic, just silence that pressed down on us like a weight. "Where is everyone?" I asked, shivering despite the warmth of the evening. Sam shrugged, but his face was tense. "Probably asleep. Let's just find someone to help us." We wandered the streets, calling out, but no one answered. The windows of the houses were dark, their curtains drawn tight. Even the shops and diners were locked up, their neon signs flickering weakly. Just as we were about to give up, we spotted a faint light in the distance. It came from the town's old inn, a sagging structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "Haven's Rest." The light flickered in one window, like a candle. Desperate, we pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit by a single lantern on the counter. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. There was a bell on the desk, and Sam rang it twice before a man shuffled out from the back room. He was old, ancient even, with skin like parchment, and eyes that seemed to peer right through you. His lips curled into a toothless smile as he spoke. "Welcome to Haven's Rest," he rasped. "You two need a room?" "Actually, our car broke down a few miles back," Sam said. "Do you know where we can find a mechanic?" The old man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that made my skin crawl. "No mechanics around here, I'm afraid, but you can stay the night. Roads aren't safe after dark." I glanced at Sam, uneasy. "What do you mean, not safe?" The man's smile widened. "Elmsworth has stories, things best avoided after sundown." Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, we stayed. We were tired, hungry, and had nowhere else to go. The old man handed us a key to room 7, and we climbed the rickety stairs to the second floor. The room was small and musty, with a single bed and a cracked mirror above the dresser. The window overlooked the empty street, the darkened town below shrouded in an oppressive stillness. As we settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Do you think he's messing with us?" Sam asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Probably," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "Let's just get some sleep and figure things out in the morning." I wish we'd left right then. It started around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard it, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on glass. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and saw the window. A pale hand was pressed against the outside, its fingers long and skeletal. "Sam," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Sam, look!" But when he turned, the hand was gone. "You're just tired," he said, though he looked uneasy. "Go back to sleep." I tried, but the tapping came again, louder this time. Then the door to our room creaked open. We both froze, staring as the door swung inward, revealing the empty hallway beyond. "Is someone there?" Sam called, his voice shaking. No answer. He got up, grabbed the lantern from the nightstand, and stepped into the hall. "Stay here," he whispered. I wanted to stop him, but fear rooted me to the bed. I listened as his footsteps receded down the corridor, the silence swallowing him. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. He didn't come back. "Sam?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Gathering what little courage I had, I grabbed the lantern and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. The lantern's light barely cut through the darkness, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Sam?" I called again, louder this time. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Then, from the far end of the corridor, I saw something move. A figure, pale and thin, stepped into the light. Its face was wrong, distorted, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched into an unnatural grin. I ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, the walls closing in around me. Doors lined either side, each one rattling as if something was trying to get out. Finally, I stumbled into the lobby, gasping for air. The old man was gone, and the lantern on the counter had gone out. But the front door was open, and beyond it was the street. I bolted outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. "Sam!" I screamed, spinning around. "Where are you?" A voice answered, faint and distorted, coming from the direction of the woods. "Here." I turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the forest, but something was wrong. His posture was stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, they were empty, lifeless. Sam, I whispered, taking a step closer. He smiled, and it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too sharp. Come with me, he said, his voice not quite his own. I stumbled back, shaking my head. You're not him. The figure laughed, a low guttural sound that echoed through the empty streets. Then it stepped forward, its limbs elongating, its body twisting into something inhuman. I turned and ran, my screams swallowed by the night. I don't remember how I made it out of Elmsworth. When I finally reached the highway, a trucker found me, shaking and covered in scratches. He drove me to the nearest town, where I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said Elmsworth didn't exist, that it had been abandoned decades ago after a fire destroyed most of the town. No one lives there, they said. No one's been there in years. I've tried to move on to convince myself it was all a nightmare, but sometimes late at night, I hear the tapping on my window, and when I look, I see a pale hand pressed against the glass.
Story number 8.
The house on Ridge Hollow Road had been abandoned for years, or so everyone said. It was one of those places you'd hear about in local ghost stories, the kind parents told to keep their kids from wandering too far. Stay away from that house, they'd warn. The Hollow's curse will take you. I never believed in curses. I thought the stories were nothing more than small-town superstition, a way to explain the inexplicable. That was until the night my friends and I decided to prove it wasn't haunted. It started as a dare. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Emily, and our friends Jason, Claire, and Matt. We were bored teenagers looking for a thrill, and the house was the perfect target. We drove up just after sundown, parking at the edge of the overgrown driveway. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and shattered, the roof sagging under years of neglect. This is such a bad idea, Emily whispered as we stepped out of the car. Come on, it's just a creepy old house, Jason said, grinning. What's the worst that could happen? The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of mildew clung to everything. Our flashlights illuminated peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a grand staircase. The first hour was uneventful. We explored the house, laughing nervously at every creak of the floorboards and the occasional scuttle of mice in the walls. It wasn't until we reached the second floor that things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. The walls seemed to close in, and the house, which had been silent moments before, was now filled with faint whispers. Do you hear that? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Hear what? Jason said, though his cocky grin was gone. The voices, she said, spinning around. They're everywhere. I strained to listen, and then I heard it too. A low, murmuring sound, like dozens of people whispering just out of earshot. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Let's go, Emily said, grabbing my arm. We shouldn't be here. But Jason wasn't ready to leave. It's just the wind, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. You guys are overreacting. He led us into one of the bedrooms, a large space with a cracked mirror hanging on the far wall. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as we entered. The air was icy now, our breath visible in the beam of our flashlights. Then the door slammed shut behind us. We all screamed, spinning around to see that the door, which had been hanging loosely on its hinges, was now shut tight. Matt lunged for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Help me! He shouted, and Jason joined him, yanking on the door with all his strength. But it wouldn't move. That's when the scratching started. It came from the walls at first, faint and rhythmic, like nails scraping against wood. Then it grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making the noise was desperate to get out. Or in. What the hell is that? Claire cried, backing into the corner. The mirror on the wall began to rattle, vibrating violently until it shattered, sending shards of glass across the room. In its place was a dark void, a gaping blackness that seemed to pulse and breathe. And then we saw her. She emerged from the void, a woman with hollow eyes and skin stretched too tightly over her skeletal frame. Her head lolled to the side as if her neck was broken, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Get out, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Get out! We didn't need to be told twice. The door flew open, and we bolted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the empty house. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more frantic until they became screams. As we reached the stairs, Jason tripped and fell, tumbling down the wooden steps with a sickening thud. Emily screamed, rushing to his side, but before she could reach him, he was dragged backward by an unseen force. His fingers clawed at the floor, leaving gouges in the wood as he was pulled into the shadows. "Jason!" Matt shouted, but he was gone. We didn't stop. There was no time. We burst through the front door and ran for the car, piling in as fast as we could. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. As we sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing on the porch watching us. Her hollow eyes burned into mine, and though we were far away, I could still hear her whisper. We went straight to the police, but when they searched the house, there was no sign of Jason. They found his footprints in the dust, leading into the house, but they stopped abruptly on the second floor. There was no evidence of what had happened, no explanation for his disappearance. The authorities ruled it a tragic accident, said he must have fallen into an old well or some other hidden danger in the house. But we knew the truth. Jason wasn't the first to disappear in that house. Over the years, dozens of people had gone missing in Ridge Hollow, their bodies never found. The townsfolk whispered about a curse, about a woman who had been murdered there long ago. Some said she was a witch, her soul bound to the house, luring in the curious and the foolish to take revenge. We never went back. None of us could bear to talk about it, not even to each other. But I still see her in my dreams. Her hollow eyes, her broken smile, and I know she's waiting.
Story number 9.
There's a stretch of road just outside my hometown in the Midwest that everyone calls Deadman's Curve. It's a winding, narrow pass bordered by thick woods on one side and a steep ravine on the other. The stories about it have been around for decades. Phantom hitchhikers, glowing eyes in the trees, cars that veer off for no apparent reason. But I never believed any of it. That changed one stormy night last October. It was late, close to midnight, and I was driving home from my shift at the diner. The rain was coming down hard, my wipers barely keeping up with the sheets of water hammering the windshield. The road was slick, and the trees lining the curve seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. As I approached the curve, my headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road, a woman, soaked to the bone, her long hair plastered to her face. She was wearing a pale dress that clung to her body in the rain. I slowed down, rolling down the window just enough to shout over the storm. "Do you need a ride?" She didn't answer, just stood there, staring at me with wide, haunted eyes. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her over the rain. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the woods, then climbed into the passenger seat. She didn't say a word, just sat there shivering, wet and gritty, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She turned to me, her eyes dark and glassy. "Just past the curve." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. Something about her was off. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dress looked like it belonged to another era. But I told myself she was just cold and scared, maybe lost. I drove on, the car crawling along the treacherous curve. The rain was relentless, the road vanishing into the darkness beyond my headlights. I glanced at the woman, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the woods behind her. Shadows darting between the trees, too fast and too large to be animals. "Do you live around here?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, like she was speaking from far away. "I used to." Before I could ask her what she meant, the car lurched violently, skidding sideways. I fought the wheel, heart pounding, as the tires squealed against the wet pavement. We came to a stop inches from the edge of the ravine. I turned to check on her, but the passenger seat was empty. For a moment, I just sat there, my mind racing. Had she gotten out? Was I imagining things? I looked around, but there was no sign of her, no footprints in the mud, but no shadow disappearing into the woods. "Hello?" I called, stepping out into the rain. The storm swallowed my voice, the wind howling like a living thing. I should have gotten back in the car and driven away, but something compelled me to stay. I crossed to the edge of the woods, peering into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A faint glow deeper in the forest, flickering like a lantern. "Hello?" I called again, moving toward the light. My boots sank into the muddy ground as I pushed through the underbrush, the rain soaking me to the bone. The light grew brighter as I approached, resolving into the outline of an old cabin. It looked ancient, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The door hung open, swinging on rusted hinges. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But then I heard it, a woman's voice, faint and pleading, coming from inside. Help me. I stepped through the doorway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air inside was cold, colder than the storm outside, and smelled of damp wood and decay. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, facing a cracked mirror on the wall. Hello? I said, my voice shaking. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and flaring like it was struggling to stay alive. That's when I saw her again. She was standing in the mirror, her reflection staring back at me even though the room behind her was empty. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face and her hands were pressed against the glass. Please, she whispered. Help me. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling. Her expression twisted, her face contorting in anguish. He's coming. Before I could ask who, the cabin began to shake. The walls groaned, the floor buckling beneath my feet. The mirror cracked, fractures spiderwebbing across the glass, and then I saw him. A figure loomed behind her in the reflection, tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm, and she screamed. A blood-curdling sound that echoed through the cabin. The mirror shattered, the shards raining down around me. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. I don't remember how I got out of the woods. The next thing I knew, I was back in my car, the rain still pounding on the roof. The passenger seat was empty, but the door was open, water pooling on the floor. I slammed it shut and sped away, not stopping until I reached my house. I locked every door and window, sitting in the dark with a blanket around my shoulders, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I went to the local library, desperate for answers. I found an old newspaper article about a woman who had died on Deadman's Curve decades ago. Her car had skidded off the road in a storm, plunging into the ravine. Her body was never recovered. But that wasn't the most chilling part. According to the article, her name was Eleanor Grayson, and she'd been running from someone the night she died. Witnesses claimed she'd been seen arguing with a man just hours before the crash, a man who matched the description of the shadow I'd seen in the mirror. They say her spirit is still trapped there, bound to the curve where she died, trying to escape the darkness that claimed her. And sometimes, if the storm is just right, she'll appear to warn others before it's too late. I haven't driven that road since. But every time it rains, I think about Eleanor and wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone to save her.